An old man living in solitude, enjoying his quiet nights with a cup of tea, until armed men break into his home, thinking he's an easy target. But as they start disappearing one by one, they realize too late, he's not the prey, he's the predator. And the man who sent them? He just made a deadly mistake. Vlad Petrov sat in his leather armchair, the weight of years pressing gently against his frame. The dim glow of a single lamp bathed the room in a warm, golden hue as he turned the pages of an old book, the paper thin beneath his fingers. A porcelain cup of tea rested on the table beside him, its steam curling lazily toward the ceiling. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, whispering secrets to the night. It was a quiet life, one he had built with careful precision. The solitude of his isolated home suited him, far from the noise of the world, far from the ghosts of his past. He took a slow sip of tea, savoring the warmth that spread through his chest, when a subtle noise disrupted the stillness. A movement. Vlad placed his cup down and glanced at the screen of the security monitor on the far wall. The grainy footage displayed the shadows outside, barely discernible in the darkness. Then, a shift, just a flicker. A figure moved near the tree line, followed by another. He leaned forward, his sharp eyes scanning the footage. 5 men. Their movements were deliberate, practiced. They weren't lost hikers. Vlad exhaled slowly, placing the book aside. The old instincts flared to life, pushing away the years of silence. He reached over and turned off the lamp, plunging the room into darkness. His house was a fortress disguised as a sanctuary. He had designed it that way, knowing that one day the past might come knocking. Moving with quiet efficiency, he navigated through the shadows, disabling the exterior lights and triggering the first layer of silent countermeasures. The night grew darker, swallowing the figures outside. The intruders advanced cautiously, their weapons held close. They thought they were in control. They thought they had the advantage. They were wrong. Vlad reached into a cabinet and pulled out an old combat knife, its steel blade reflecting the faintest glimmer of moonlight. He traced a finger along the edge, feeling the familiar weight in his grip. His other hand moved toward a hidden compartment under the bookshelf, revealing a pistol with a silencer already attached. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't running. He was preparing. Through the security feed, he watched as the men split into two groups, 3 approaching from the front, 2 circling the back. A textbook assault. He noted their footwork, their movements. Professional, but not elite. They were expecting an easy kill. That would be their first mistake. Vlad's fingers danced over a concealed switch near the hallway entrance, activating the second phase of his traps. Outside, a thin wire adjusted ever so slightly between 2 trees. A whisper of movement, a shift in the wind. One of the intruders took a step forward and froze, a soft click. The silence of the night was shattered by a muffled gasp as the man was yanked upward, his rifle slipping from his grasp. Suspended, his body twitched in the air for only a moment before his breath stopped completely. Vlad allowed himself a slow breath. 1 down. The others wouldn't notice right away. The darkness masked too much. He moved swiftly, positioning himself near the hallway that led to the back entrance. His heartbeat was steady, controlled. He had done this before. The second group reached the rear door. He could hear their hushed voices, their whispered commands. They thought they were moving unnoticed. He adjusted his grip on the pistol. The hunt had begun. Diego Ramirez raised a clenched fist, signaling his men to stop. The night was too quiet. Something felt off. He narrowed his eyes at the darkened house ahead. The plan had been simple. Break in, eliminate the old man, and make it look like a robbery. Yet something gnawed at him. He turned to Leo Vasquez, the youngest of the group, and motioned for him to move forward. Leo nodded hesitantly and crept toward the front door, his boots silent against the damp earth. The others followed closely, their weapons at the ready. The air was thick with tension. Inside, hidden in the shadows, Vlad watched. He studied their movements, the way they communicated without words. He had seen this before, paramilitary training, but not military discipline. They were good, but not prepared for him. Leo reached the door and tested the handle. Unlocked. His lips curled in satisfaction. He signaled Diego, who nodded for him to proceed. With careful precision, Leo pushed the door open, the hinges barely making a sound. The house was dark, too dark. He stepped inside. Behind him, the others followed, their weapons sweeping the room in coordinated arcs. Their eyes adjusted to the gloom, scanning for movement. The furniture was neatly arranged, a book left open on the armrest, a cup of tea sitting half full on a small table. It was as if the owner had just been here. Diego signaled for them to split up. Leo, eager to prove himself, veered left while the others moved deeper into the house. Vlad exhaled slowly. Leo had just made a fatal mistake. Silent as a shadow, Vlad moved through the darkness, tracking the young man's every step. Leo's breathing was steady but quickened slightly when he glanced over his shoulder, sensing something unseen. He wasn't wrong. A fraction of a second later, an arm snaked around his throat, tightening with practiced efficiency. Leo barely had time to react. His rifle slipped from his grip as he was pulled into the abyss of the hallway. He kicked once, then twice, but Vlad held firm. The struggle lasted mere seconds before the young man's body went limp. Vlad lowered him soundlessly to the floor, his eyes already shifting back toward the main group. The absence of Leo wasn't noticed immediately. The others continued their sweep, their movements precise. Diego led the way, checking corners and keeping his senses sharp, but something felt wrong. Then he noticed. "Leo?" His voice was barely above a whisper, no response. He turned, scanning the room, his hand clenched into a fist. "Leo," he repeated, this time sharper. Still nothing. The others stopped, exchanging uneasy glances. Diego's gut twisted. This wasn't right. He pointed at one of the men, a burly enforcer named Vargas. "Find him." Vargas nodded, gripping his rifle as he retraced Leo's steps. He moved cautiously, his eyes darting from shadow to shadow. Vlad waited, a single misstep. That was all he needed. Vargas took another step forward, right where Vlad wanted him. A wire snapped. Before he could react, a metal spike shot upward, piercing through his ribcage with a sickening crunch. His body convulsed once before slumping. The muffled sound of his fall sent a cold shiver through the others. Diego's breath hitched. This was no ordinary target. The realization dawned too late. Vlad Petrov wasn't the hunted, he was the predator. Diego's fingers tightened around his rifle. The air inside the house had turned thick, oppressive, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Two of his men were gone. No gunfire, no struggle, just gone. This was supposed to be easy. He gestured sharply, signaling the remaining men to stay close. They moved cautiously, their nerves fraying with each passing second. Vlad, unseen in the shadows, listened. He could hear their breaths, the slight tremor in their steps. Fear. It had begun to set in. He had spent a lifetime studying it, using it. Fear made men reckless. It made them weak. One of the gunmen, a wiry man named Torres, whispered urgently, "This ain't right, Diego. Where the hell is Leo? Where's Vargas?" Diego didn't answer. He was listening. Then he heard it. Just a faint rustle, like fabric brushing against wood. His rifle snapped toward the sound. "Show yourself, old man." Silence. Then a voice, low and measured, from somewhere in the darkness. "You were sent here to kill me." Diego stiffened. His men shifted uneasily, gripping their weapons tighter. "You thought I was just an easy target, an old man living alone," Vlad continued, his voice calm. "Whoever sent you, they didn't tell you the truth, did they?" Diego swallowed hard, his mind raced. Who the hell was this guy? Torres cursed under his breath. "This is bullshit. We should fall back." Diego ignored him. "You're good, I'll give you that. But you're outnumbered, old man. You can't hide forever." A chuckle, cold, amused. "I don't need to hide." A flicker of movement. Gunfire erupted as Torres panicked, unloading his clip into the shadows. The muzzle flashes lit up the room in bursts, revealing only empty space. Then, before anyone could react, something crashed against the window. Vargas's lifeless body, his wide, glassy eyes staring through the broken glass. One of the men screamed. Vlad moved. A swift, brutal strike sent another gunman crumpling to the ground before he could even raise his weapon. The remaining man turned to fire, but a blade sliced across his throat before he could squeeze the trigger. Diego staggered backward, his rifle shaking in his grip. "Who the fuck are you?" Vlad stepped into the dim light, his expression unreadable. Blood spattered his hands, but his breathing remained calm, steady. "You don't know?" Vlad asked, tilting his head slightly. "Then your boss didn't prepare you." Diego's stomach twisted. He had taken jobs like this before, targets who were just names on a list. But something about this was different. You weren't a random job, Vlad continued. This wasn't just a contract. Someone sent you with a purpose. Diego's lips parted, but no words came out. Vlad took a step closer. Who? Diego hesitated. He wasn't afraid of death. He had stared it in the face before, but this was different. This wasn't just a man standing before him. This was something else, something old, something lethal. The name, Vlad pressed, his tone unyielding. Diego exhaled, his mind racing. I don't know, he admitted. We were paid well. The job came from up top. Who hired you? Diego swallowed hard. Some Russian. Vlad's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. His name, Vlad demanded. I don't have one, Diego said quickly. But he knew you. He told us you weren't just some old man. He said you were KGB. The words hung in the air. Vlad's grip on the knife tightened. Memories he had buried long ago clawed their way to the surface. The cold streets of Moscow, the missions, the betrayals, the escape that had cost him everything. So they had found him, again. He took a slow breath, forcing himself to remain still. He could kill Diego now. It would be easy, but not yet. There was more to learn, and he needed answers. The house had become a graveyard of silence. Diego stood frozen, his grip on his rifle tight, his knuckles white. 3 men were dead. Leo had vanished. And now, the old man, this Vlad Petrov, had emerged from the darkness, revealing more than just skill. He was a ghost from another life. We need to go, Torres whispered, his voice barely audible. His hands trembled as he reloaded his weapon. This ain't just some old man. This is a fucking nightmare. Diego's jaw clenched. Running wasn't an option. If they failed, there wouldn't be a second chance. The people who had sent them wouldn't tolerate failure. Vlad watched them from the shadows, his body moving with the quiet grace of a predator. He had heard their whispers, seen the tension creeping into their stance. They weren't just losing numbers, they were losing their nerve. Fear was a powerful weapon. He adjusted his position, pressing his back against the cold wall. The house was his battlefield, and he had spent years preparing for a night like this. He moved with deliberate slowness, stepping around the body at his feet, careful not to let the bloodstain disrupt his balance. His mind calculated every detail, the placement of the remaining intruders, their likely movements, their growing desperation. Desperate men made mistakes. Diego inhaled deeply, forcing control into his voice. Spread out. Check the rooms. He's just one man. Just one man. Vlad smirked. Torres hesitated before stepping toward the hallway. His fingers twitched on the trigger, sweat dripping down his temple. The hallway was pitch black, stretching ahead like a tunnel into the unknown. He took another step, a whisper of movement, a snap. Something lashed out from the darkness, wrapping around his ankle. Before he could react, his feet were swept out from under him, and he crashed onto his back with a choked gasp. His rifle clattered against the floor. Diego and the last remaining man spun toward the noise, weapons raised. Silence, then a gurgled breath. Torres's body twitched in the hallway, his throat slit, blood pooling beneath him. Diego's breath hitched. This was no longer a fight. This was a massacre. The last gunman, a thick-set man named Ruiz, turned to Diego, panic flaring in his eyes. We need to get the fuck out of here. Diego ignored him. His mind was racing. How had this gone so wrong? Then a new noise, a clicking sound. His eyes darted to the floor. A thin, nearly invisible wire stretched across the entrance of the hallway, connected to... Move! Diego yelled, but it was too late. The trap triggered. A mechanical hiss filled the air as a spring-loaded mechanism released. A thick steel spike shot forward from the side of the hallway, impaling Ruiz through the stomach. His scream was brief, then silence. Diego stumbled back, his mind spinning. He was the last one left. Vlad stepped forward, his figure barely visible in the darkness. You should have left when you had the chance. Diego's heart pounded against his ribs. He raised his rifle. A sharp pain shot through his wrist. The gun clattered to the floor as Vlad's knife buried itself in his forearm. Diego fell to his knees, clutching the wound, his vision blurring. Vlad loomed over him, his expression unreadable. You had your orders, Vlad murmured, crouching down. Who sent you? Diego clenched his jaw, blood dripping between his fingers. He had no choice now. Vlad wasn't going to let him leave. But Diego still had one card left to play, a distraction. His eyes flickered toward the nearest exit, calculating his next move. He had to escape, He had to survive. Pain pulsed through Diego's arm as blood dripped steadily from the wound. His breath came in short, sharp gasps as he knelt on the cold floor, his rifle lost in the darkness. He was the last one left. Vlad stood over him, his silhouette barely visible in the dim light. His eyes were unreadable, his posture controlled, like a man who had done this before. And Diego knew, without a doubt, that he had. The old man crouched, gripping the handle of the knife still embedded in Diego's arm. He twisted it just slightly. Diego hissed through clenched teeth. "Who sent you?" Vlad's voice was quiet, almost casual. Diego clenched his jaw. "Go to hell." Vlad exhaled, shaking his head. Then, without warning, he yanked the blade free. Diego groaned, his body shuddering from the sudden rush of pain. His vision blurred for a moment. Vlad wiped the knife clean against Diego's shirt. "You don't have the luxury of pride right now," he said calmly. Diego let out a sharp breath, his mind racing. He had to find a way out of this. "You don't need to do this," he muttered. "Just kill me and get it over with." Vlad tilted his head, considering. "That's the problem with your generation. You rush to die instead of fighting to live." He stood, grabbing Diego by the collar and dragging him across the floor. Diego struggled weakly, but his strength was waning. His vision spun as Vlad pulled him into a small, windowless room, some kind of storage area. The old man kicked a chair toward him. "Sit." Diego hesitated. Vlad's knife flashed again. Diego swallowed hard and obeyed. With swift efficiency, Vlad tied his wrists behind the chair, securing them with rope that dug into his skin. Then, silence. Diego lifted his head, watching as Vlad leaned against the wall, arms crossed. The old man wasn't in a rush. "You were never here to rob me," Vlad said finally. "That was just the cover story." Diego didn't answer. Vlad stepped forward. "Who ordered the hit?" Diego stayed silent. Vlad sighed. Then, in one fluid motion, he grabbed Diego's wounded arm and pressed his thumb into the open gash. Diego gasped, his back arching against the chair. His jaw clenched so tightly he thought his teeth might crack. "You don't have to tell me everything," Vlad murmured, his thumb digging deeper. "Just enough to keep yourself breathing." Diego let out a ragged breath. "Who?" Vlad repeated. Diego squeezed his eyes shut. "We weren't supposed to ask. Just a name." Vlad waited. Diego licked his dry lips. "Orlov, that's all I know." Vlad's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes darkened. "Sergei Orlov?" Diego gave a weak shrug. "I don't know. Just Orlov." Vlad took a slow breath, his fingers loosening their grip on Diego's wound. The name confirmed what he had already suspected. This wasn't random. This was personal. "You were never meant to leave here alive," Vlad said quietly. "You understand that now, don't you?" Diego met his gaze. Vlad wasn't threatening him. He was stating a fact. Diego's throat tightened. "Then kill me already." Vlad studied him for a long moment. Then unexpectedly he smirked. "No," he said simply. Diego frowned. "What?" Vlad turned away, grabbing a small towel and tossing it onto Diego's lap. "You're more useful breathing." Diego swallowed hard. He wasn't sure if that was good or bad. Outside, the wind howled against the walls. Somewhere in the darkness, danger was still waiting. The room was small, suffocating. Diego sat bound to the chair, his body aching, his arms still bleeding. The pain dulled, but the fear remained sharp. Across from him, Vlad stood in perfect stillness, his gaze locked onto him like a predator watching prey. Minutes passed, maybe more. The silence stretched, pressing down like a weight. Diego swallowed hard. He had been trained to withstand interrogation, but this was different. There was no yelling, no threats, no visible signs of aggression. Just the old man standing there, staring, and somehow that was worse. "You're a soldier," Vlad finally said, breaking the quiet. His voice was level, calculated. "Not a professional, a killer for hire." Diego exhaled through his nose. He refused to respond. Vlad took a slow step forward. "You've been doing this for a while, haven't you? Maybe a dozen hits, maybe more. But this one felt different." Diego kept his expression neutral. Vlad smirked. "You knew something was wrong the moment you stepped inside. The silence, the missing bodies, the way the house felt like a trap waiting to be sprung." Diego's fingers twitched against the rope. Vlad crouched slightly, bringing himself to eye level. "And yet, You stayed. Diego shifted, his muscles tensing. You didn't run, Vlad continued, his voice quieter now, more focused. Because you weren't just hired to kill me. You were sent to die, weren't you? Diego flinched. Vlad caught it. A slow smile crossed his face. They never planned for you to come back alive. Diego clenched his jaw. Shut up. That's why they didn't give you more details, Vlad pressed. Why you only had a name. Why they made sure you felt confident enough to charge in, thinking I was just some old fool. Diego's breathing quickened. But deep down, Vlad said, tilting his head slightly, you knew something was off, and you still walked into the fire. Diego's throat was dry. You don't know shit about me. Vlad leaned closer. I know fear when I see it. Diego's hands balled into fists behind the chair. Vlad stood again, pacing slowly. Tell me, Diego, how much were you paid? Diego hesitated. How much was your life worth? Silence. Then, barely above a whisper, 50 grand. Vlad exhaled through his nose. 50 grand, he repeated, shaking his head. They sent you to your death for 50 grand. Diego looked away, his pulse hammering in his ears. Vlad continued. And the man who hired you, he was Eastern European, wasn't he? Diego hesitated, then gave a slight nod. Vlad had expected as much. He knew who it was. Sergei Orlov, a name he hadn't heard in years. A name that should have stayed buried. Vlad's fingers traced along the handle of his knife, his mind working through the possibilities. If Orlov had found him, it meant one thing. This wasn't over. And Diego? He was now just another piece on the board. Vlad turned back to the young man. I should kill you. Diego didn't flinch this time. Then do it. But Vlad only smirked. No, not yet. Before Diego could ask what that meant, a distant sound reached their ears. Footsteps outside. Reinforcements. Vlad sighed. Looks like you won't die alone after all. Diego's stomach twisted. The game had just begun. The distant crunch of boots against gravel sent a shiver through Diego's spine. Reinforcements. He wasn't sure whether to feel relief or dread. Vlad turned his head slightly, listening. His expression remained unreadable, but Diego noticed the subtle shift in his stance, the calm calculation of a man already planning his next move. You were supposed to die tonight, Vlad murmured, almost to himself. And yet they sent more. Diego swallowed hard. Maybe they want to make sure the job is done. Vlad's smirk was barely visible in the dim light. No, if they were sure of that, they wouldn't bother sending reinforcements. They expected you to fail. Diego's stomach twisted. Vlad stepped toward the window, careful to remain in the shadows. He pulled the curtain back just enough to glimpse outside. 5 figures moved cautiously, weapons drawn, their silhouettes barely visible under the moonlight. Not an extraction team, an execution squad. Diego tugged at his restraints. If they're here to clean up loose ends, that includes me. Vlad turned, amusement flickering in his eyes. You're catching on. Diego's breath quickened. He had been set up from the beginning. Orlov hadn't just sent them after some retired old man. He had sent them into a trap, knowing they wouldn't make it out. And now the real cleaners were here to finish the job. Vlad reached into a drawer, pulling out a suppressed pistol. He checked the magazine before sliding it back into place. They won't expect you to still be alive, Vlad said casually. That gives us an advantage. Diego scoffed. Us? Vlad arched a brow. Would you rather stay tied to that chair when they come in? Diego hesitated. He wanted to believe that if he called out, the new team would recognize him and stand down. But deep down, he knew better. They were here to erase all traces of the mission, including him. Vlad stepped closer, blade in hand. I'll cut you loose, but if you try anything stupid, you won't get a second chance. Diego nodded. He had no choice. With a swift slice, the ropes fell away. Diego flexed his wrists, wincing at the stiffness. Vlad tossed him a sidearm. Make yourself useful. Diego caught it, his fingers curling around the grip. He had never expected to be fighting alongside his target, but nothing about this night had gone according to plan. Outside, the new team reached the front door. Vlad exhaled slowly, positioning himself behind the entryway. They'll come in fast. We take the first 2 out before they realize what's happening. The rest will hesitate. Diego checked the chamber of his gun, nodding. And then? Vlad's smile was cold. And then we make sure Orlov gets the message. A second later, the door creaked open. The hunt was back on. The door swung open slowly, its hinges barely making a sound. The first man stepped inside, his rifle raised, scanning the room with practiced efficiency. The second followed close behind, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. They moved like professionals, silent, coordinated, lethal. But they weren't ready for Vlad. From the shadows, he struck. A single gunshot, suppressed, whispered through the air. The first man collapsed, a clean hole between his eyes. Before the second could react, Vlad lunged forward, grabbing him by the collar and twisting his head sharply. A sickening crack echoed through the room. 2 down. Diego watched, momentarily frozen. The old man moved with terrifying efficiency, each motion precise, deliberate. This wasn't just experience, this was instinct. A voice crackled over the dead men's radios. "Report, do you have visual?" No response. Diego tightened his grip on his pistol. "They're gonna know something's wrong." Vlad nodded, already moving toward the hallway. "That's the idea." Outside, the remaining 3 approached cautiously, sensing the shift in the air. They weren't amateurs. They wouldn't storm in blindly. Vlad gestured toward the back door. "Flank them." Diego hesitated. "You sure about this?" Vlad gave him a look. Diego exhaled sharply, then nodded. Moving swiftly, he slipped out, keeping low. The night air was cold against his skin as he navigated around the side of the house. Vlad remained inside, stepping over the bodies. He picked up one of the fallen men's radios and pressed the button. "Sector clear," he said, mimicking the dead operative's voice with chilling accuracy. A pause, then, "Copy, moving in." They took the bait. The moment the first man crossed the threshold, Vlad fired. The silenced shot struck him in the throat. He stumbled back, choking on his own blood. The other 2 reacted instantly, taking cover and returning fire. Muffled bursts of suppressed gunfire tore through the house. Vlad ducked behind a pillar, his mind already calculating their next moves. Then, Diego made his move. He emerged from the side, catching one of them off guard. A single shot to the head dropped him instantly. The last man spun, realizing too late that he was alone. Vlad stepped out of the shadows, his gun trained on him. "Drop it!" The operative hesitated, his hands trembling. Diego exhaled. "You're already dead. Just make it easy." The man clenched his jaw, his mind racing. Then, with a resigned breath, he let his weapon slip from his fingers. Vlad wasted no time. He stepped forward and pressed his knife to the man's throat. "Who sent you?" The operative swallowed hard. I don't know." Vlad applied more pressure. "Try again." The man shuddered. "We get orders from the top. We don't ask questions." Vlad's expression darkened. The past was coming for him, and it wasn't done yet. With a final twist, he ended the man's life. Diego exhaled, lowering his weapon. "Now what?" Vlad looked down at the body. Then, almost as if speaking to himself, he murmured, "Now we hunt," because Sergei Orlov had just made a mistake. He had left Vlad alive. The battlefield had fallen silent. Vlad stood amidst the bodies, his expression unreadable. The faint scent of gunpowder and blood lingered in the air, mixing with the cold night breeze seeping through the broken door. Diego lowered his gun, his hands still shaking slightly from the adrenaline. "That was the cleanup crew," he muttered. "They were here to make sure we didn't walk out of this alive." Vlad didn't respond immediately. His mind was elsewhere, calculating, processing. This wasn't just a hit, it was a message, and messages needed replies. He crouched over one of the fallen operatives, swiftly searching the body. A knife, spare ammo, radio, nothing unusual. Then his fingers brushed against something inside the man's vest pocket, a small envelope. Vlad stood, peeling it open with careful precision. Inside, a single folded piece of paper. He unfolded it, his gaze narrowing at the words scrawled across it. "Welcome back, comrade." Diego stepped closer. "What is it?" Vlad didn't answer immediately. He stared at the note, the weight of its meaning pressing against his chest. Sergei Orlov. It had to be him. No one else would call him that. No one else would dare. Diego shifted uncomfortably. Who the hell is doing this? Vlad folded the note and slipped it into his pocket. Someone I should have killed a long time ago. Diego exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. Great. And now he's hunting you. Vlad looked at him, his gaze sharp. No, now I'm hunting him. Diego hesitated. He could see it now. This wasn't fear in Vlad's eyes, it was something else, something darker. Who is he? Diego asked carefully. Vlad turned back to the bodies, searching another one. Sergei Orlov, he said simply. He was KGB. Diego frowned. Like you? Vlad's jaw tightened. No, not like me. Diego caught the shift in his tone, but he didn't push. He had spent enough time around killers to recognize when someone was reliving a ghost from their past. Vlad pulled a phone from the dead man's pocket. Locked. He studied it for a moment, then tossed it to Diego. Can you get into this? Diego turned it over in his hands. Not here, but I know someone. Vlad nodded. We need to move. Now. Diego glanced around at the carnage. What about this place? Vlad exhaled. His home, his quiet sanctuary, was no longer safe. He had known, deep down, that this day would come. He had been foolish to think he could outrun it forever. He reached for a remote near the fireplace and pressed a button. A low beep echoed through the house. Diego stiffened. What the hell did you just do? Vlad slipped the remote into his coat, making sure there's nothing left for them to track. A moment later, the faint sound of gas being released from the vents filled the house. A silent countdown had begun. Diego's eyes widened. You're blowing up the damn house? Vlad walked toward the door. I built this place to be erased if necessary, and it's necessary. Diego cursed under his breath, but followed. He wasn't about to stick around when an ex-KGB assassin decided it was time to disappear. As they stepped outside, Vlad took one last look at his home, the place where he had tried to leave the past behind. But the past had found him. With one final push of the button, the house erupted into flames, the explosion tearing through the walls, consuming everything in an instant. Vlad didn't flinch. He simply turned and walked into the night. Because this wasn't over, it was just beginning. The fire roared behind them, painting the night sky in flickering shades of orange and red. The house, Vlad's refuge, his attempt at peace, was gone, reduced to ash. He didn't look back. Diego kept pace beside him, still gripping the stolen phone. So what now? Vlad didn't answer immediately. He had spent years staying hidden, avoiding the ghosts of his past. But now, the past had come looking for him, and he wasn't running anymore. Orlov wanted me to know he was coming, Vlad murmured. That note wasn't a warning. Diego frowned. Then what was it? A challenge. Diego shook his head. You seriously gonna go after this guy? He's got resources. People like the ones we just dealt with. Vlad gave him a sharp look. And, Diego exhaled, and nothing. Just never thought I'd be teaming up with the guy I was sent to kill. Vlad smirked. You have two choices, Diego. Walk away and pretend none of this happened, or come with me and learn what it really means to fight. Diego hesitated. He had spent years working for people like Orlov, men who saw soldiers like him as disposable. Vlad was the first person to offer something different. He looked at the phone in his hand. I know someone who can break into this. It'll tell us where Orlov is. Vlad nodded. Then that's where we start. Diego glanced at him. And after that? Vlad's expression darkened. Then I finish this. The wind howled as they disappeared into the night, leaving behind the flames, the bodies, and the war that had only just begun. Because Vlad Petrov wasn't done yet, and Sergei Orlov had just made his last mistake. Sometimes the past isn't something you can run from, it's something you have to face head on. Vlad Petrov spent years trying to leave his old life behind, but when the ghosts of his past came knocking, he had only one choice: to fight. In the end, survival isn't about who is stronger, but who is willing to do whatever it takes. Now tell me, if you were in Vlad's shoes, would you have fought back, or would you have tried to escape? Click the video on the screen to continue your journey of self-discovery and uncover more stories that challenge the way we see the world. And if you haven't already, subscribe now so you never miss another story like this. See you in the next one.